everyone, welcome back. This is part 2 of our module 3 addressing the topic of constructivism, and on this slide we have just a diagram really that attempts to set out how the idea of interference reflexivity that we've been discussing, how that might apply for international relations. So we're simply talking about the basic myth here of realism and liberalism, and trying to use them rather, instead of saying that they're scientific theories that help us explain the world, we're rather looking at them themselves as objects of study, if you want to put it in those terms. We're looking at them as discourses or as myths or stories about how the world works, and then how we as human beings interpret that world. And I think that's very interesting for us, that we can look at the logic or the structure of anarchy this way, trying to figure out how these myths or stories about realism and liberalism actually change our behavior and turn us into who we are. So earlier on at the start of the lecture we talked about the difference between seeing the world as populated by Mahatma Gandhis and seeing the world as populated by Osama bin Laden's. And here in diagram form we put a little bit more emphasis on detail into what these terms mean. We're saying that just, and you see here this loop, we've got the interference reflexivity loop here going on. And so in diagram 1 here, we see clearly something that looks a lot more like realism, right? We look up into the thought bubble here and we say that the logic of anarchy is structural and it leads to conflict. So this could be a sort of a realist standpoint, right? Because it would suggest that here we have a structure called anarchy, which the population that is part of it can't really do anything about, and because of their nature, that it leads to conflict, much as it did for, say, the boys on the island in Lord of the Flies. And so the question of how our attitude then is characterized by this myth, and how our attitude then shapes our behavior, is reflected in the speech bubble that comes out of one of the population members' heads there. Fear. Okay, so we have seen then how from the realm of behavior, a creation of a certain story, and the story, once it is shared by everyone, starts to sweep back and change their behavior on and on and on, of course, into the future. So thereby explaining to us how the realm of shared beliefs influences the realm of behavior and vice versa. But that's not the end of the story, because of course if you change the content of the speech bubble and the corresponding behavior, you get a much different type of process. Here is a sort of a more liberal contention, where we say the logic of anarchy is a process. Well, obviously it's actual liberals would still say that anarchy is a structure, but that it can be mitigated and lead to cooperation. But this is what constructivists are arguing. Which is at the end of the day, I think, an idea that anarchy is what states make of it. They are aware of their loop here, the interference reflexivity loop, and they are aware in the same breath that this can be a positive sum outcome, that cooperation is possible, and that nation states don't need to be thinking about anarchy as something to fear at all. So the most important thing here is that constructivism is conscious of the loop, the self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will, the tendency towards self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. So if you think human nature sucks, the point is then that you will act as a realist or a liberal who thinks human nature sucks, but it can be mitigated over time. But if you think humans are constructed, and that human society is constructed in certain situations, then you'll be much more likely to take risks here and now. So in a sense then, what we're saying is that constructivism, in terms of its policy recommendations, if you want to get down to brass tacks, would be way more adventurous, I think, than either realism or liberalism. That in fact the entire framework of the prisoner's dilemma and the anarchic dilemma is overthrown, and that human beings could be a lot more adventurous in terms of how they try to make peace with each other. For Alexander Wendt, in the supplemental reading for this week, he describes the encounter between two aliens. And these aliens, of course, are traveling through space, and they have never encountered another sentient being at all in their lives. They're just life forms. They've never met any other creature. So far as they were aware, in the universe, there was only themselves. But what happens when they meet? They have, as we've said, never been in a social situation before. But obviously, as the realists would sort of want to contend, certainly, remember the realists said there were three S's, the state, survival, and self-help. Well, here, of course, we can see some of those S's playing out. The state, or in this case, the sovereign individual, would be conscious of itself. The second S, it would want to survive, but would it necessarily engage in self-help is the question. For Alexander Wendt, the desire to survive does not necessarily predict conflict. What in fact predicts conflict from his point of view is how the states end up actually interacting at the end, the signals they send, their responses, etc. So the result is a very open-ended process then, especially when compared to the prisoner's dilemma. I would add some animation here that sort of tries to reflect this process of signal sending, as Alexander Wendt describes it. One might imagine they would start with a greeting, and the other person would say in some sort of response, come here often. They might even have to figure out what language means. They're totally different species. They don't have a shared language. So they've got to stop and think about some process of communication. Are they going to use gestures, physical gestures? Do they have telepathy? Do they have mouths and vocal boxes that they can use to speak the way we speak? It's not clear. Okay, so in this instance, then, we have two sovereign actors who want to survive, but who don't know the meaning of communication, don't know how to engage in social activity, and they have to learn everything from scratch. And the question is, right, does their desire to survive feel threatened by this process, right? Do they feel that the process of survival, the desire to survive, is threatened at all by this process of learning to communicate? They have no idea what a threatening gesture is, or even from the alien, what the alien might do that might be a threat even in their terms. So I think I get what Alexander Wendt is saying here. The bottom line for him is that social interactions have to take place before they can be interpreted, and before the anarchy that exists between them can be interpreted as intrinsically dangerous or not, right? So if the social interactions are required, if you will, as we've said before, to give content to anarchy, right, to give it its meaning, then obviously the meaning of anarchy is dependent on the social interactions. And it's a great example. Now, the problem is, for us in the real world, of course, we're not aliens encountering each other in space, and there's already a lot of social content. But the Constructivists seem to have a point. It would seem rather a shame to think that we could do nothing to change that social content, given that we are the ones that made it in the first place. So we do have choices, I think, is what he's trying to say. Anarchy is not, a death sentence. It is not something that we have to live with the way the realists or the liberals suggest. It is, in fact, something that we have made. We've been making it for a long time now, and we will continue to make it, but we have choices every step of the way. So it's a nice idea, no? Let's try to compare this with rationalism, just so we get a little bit more drilling down, in case I have not been explicit enough about constructivism and its differences with these other theories. From a rationalist perspective, actors are, of course, as we know, ego-maximizing. That's fair enough. Their interests are fixed. That's something all rationalists agree on, whether they're realists or liberals. And so because their interests are fixed, their primary goal is, as we've noticed, survival, right? Military survival specifically. And in terms of this concept of identity that we've been discussing, do rationalists take that concept seriously? Not really. They say that identity doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's a communist state or an Islamic state or a liberal democratic state like the United States. Every state wants to preserve its good life, and so internally to itself then it has all perhaps very different values to this to our own, but externally speaking it looks like a billiard ball, and that's why we've been saying that nation states are functionally equivalent to each other in this billiard ball sense. Remember? So let's look at these things that they have in common then. They, as theories of international relations, the states are the dominant actors. They are rational actors. They're wanting to survive. They're always trying to seek their maximum advantage within the structure of anarchy. For liberals, that's possible through mitigating anarchy somewhat by domesticating the international environment and creating positive sum scenarios. But either way, liberals are not tree-hugging hippies in this sense. The liberal theorists in international relations very much believe that states are rational, interest-maximizing actors, and they want to do as well as they possibly can in international relations. And so, because of that crossover between liberals and realists in terms of rational acting, security, no matter what theory you're talking about there, is defined in terms of self-interest. But if constructivists are right, then here's something very interesting about the debate between realists and liberals, or neo-realists and liberals even. In point of fact, while realists and liberals think that they have much diversity in their views, that they are kind of opposing viewpoints, from a constructivist point of view, these two theories agree with each other more than they disagree. Most of their theoretical foundations overlap. Because both liberals and realists are rationalists. That is, they think that whatever states end up doing, they do because they are rational actors. Thus, states are understood as kind of like computers. They're computing entities, kind of like robots, if you will. And we've said billiard balls to imply that they're functionally equivalent, but what if you could imagine they were robotic billiard balls, that they had a brain, that they were constantly trying to calculate the odds of the different types of actions that they had at their in their menu of possible actions, so to speak. And as we've said, the crucial take-home point here is that for these states, identity doesn't matter, right? So it doesn't matter if it's Iran or Korea or Ireland or America. All states from a realist or liberal point of view kind of look the same. Identity doesn't really matter. Although for liberals we've said that it matters if the second image is relevant, because some of those billiard balls are going to be democratic and others aren't. But that's still nothing to do with identity. That's just to do with the type of constitution they have. If the question of identity is raised, then from a liberal perspective, really the question of the Constitution is secondary, because what the constructivists are seeing is that the relationships between the liberal and the non-liberal world aren't just defined by differences in constitution, they're defined by differences in story. Right? There are many countries out there in the so-called illiberal world that we get along with just fine. So it's not enough just to simply say that the difference here is between democracies and non-democracies. We may have good relationships with a lot of dictator countries, for example, dictatorships, and that has been the case over the years. So how is it that we come to think about some countries as friends and other countries as enemies? And also it must be said that between democratic states, despite what the liberals say, things haven't always been rosy. Remember that the Western Alliance bombed Serbia in the 90s, and that was an electoral democracy. So how do you explain that? You know, it's not clear that the liberals fully have the monopoly on explaining why conflict happens between democracies. From their point of view, that shouldn't really be happening, but it did, and there's other examples too. So they're definitely the exception, but a constructivist could step in there and say, well, Serbia, you know, is a democracy, but look at the stories that were told about Serbia. Look at how Serbia was identified in the international media, that kind of thing. And so you could start to see some opportunities there to use constructivist approach. So when we talk about the difference between rationalism and constructivism, then some things open up for us in terms of this real concept here of identity, right? And so, in fact, actually, there are two concepts that might be useful, but the identity concept is really the most important concept, I think, because what the constructivists are saying about identity is that it does matter. The social context matter. What is it that the state thinks that it is defending? What values does it believe that it is possibly shared by its community versus the values shared by the other state's community? In the case of Iran, I think that's very, very important for us here, because in American media, Iran is often identified as a country that has a sort of a semi, almost suicide bomber type community. That it is fundamentally hell-bent on annihilating itself in a sort of a religious crusade or vendetta. And of course, a realist would poo-poo that, but a constructivist can see what a realist can't see, which is that this social narrative is very, very important, and the question of identity is very, very important. And then the other thing that the constructivists bring to the table is the notion of change. Because, of course, if identity matters, then identity can be changed. And identities have changed, argue the constructivists, a lot over time. So the constructivists argue that agents and structures co-constitute. This is our loop again, right? Agents on the bottom, structure of our interpretation of anarchy rather on the top. So institutions can serve as the context then within which change can occur, because the agents can change their mind and the story can change. So we've already talked about identity and given some examples of identity in the case of Iran. So we know identity matters, but let's drill down a little bit more about change. Let's talk about the fact that, historically speaking, different contexts have led scholars to argue that historically speaking, states have had very different identities. So you could, for example, contrast the difference between France during the era of Christendom, during the era of Westphalia, and during the era of what we now call the post-Cold War moment. France in Christendom was aligned under the regime of the Vatican. The Vatican was a hierarchical power, normatively speaking, over the other nations of Europe at the time. With the arrival of Protestantism, that broke down. We've said in class about the importance of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. That's the only date that I ever ask you guys to remember. 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia was signed. And with that signature came an agreement on the part of the warring countries. There had been the 100 Years' War, which was a war brought on by the advent of Protestantism, whereby the countries in Europe were starting to fight over which religion they should be. And you had these sort of evangelical crusades on the part of each country to try to create peace and security for religious minorities in other people's countries, that kind of thing. And it went on for 100 years, tremendously bloody. And out of Westphalia then, the Treaty of Westphalia, comes this idea of to settle a norm or an agreement that henceforth that what goes on in one country should be the business of that country, and other countries should not interfere with that. So if we talk about France under Christendom, France is doing what the Vatican wishes it to do as a good Christian country. If we talk about France under the era of Westphalia, France is a realist country. France is respecting principles of non-interference and acting and regarding itself as a sovereign actor in its own right. Now, that's not to say wars, of course, didn't happen, but the norm of realism suggested that war should be separated from religious values, and that it should be the raison d'etat, the reason of state as we've called it, that determines whether a war should happen or not. And so this is a sort of a more scientific, if you will, approach to the question of where war should or shouldn't be deployed. But if we look at France today in the post-Cold War era, what is France today? Well, what we've noticed is that since the end of the Cold War, we've entered into this period since that many people call globalization. Of course, to a certain extent, those things overlap, but what's remarkable about the post-Cold War era is how much today we're talking about the existence of a global humanity, a humanity that exists around the world that we are eager to defend, to protect. And so George Bush Sr. Called this the new world order. And so we see both in his foreign policy and subsequently in the foreign policy of Clinton, and even in Bush Jr. and in Obama too, an eagerness to justify America's foreign policy, not in terms of America's self-interests, as would have happened under a realist order, but in terms of what is right or wrong to do vis-a-vis the liberal mandate that America has to protect globalization, to protect freedom of trade, to protect interdependency of globalization from terrorist attack, and to basically see to it that there is a global security for those that would wish to play globalization by the rules. So that's really fascinating for us, that whether it's France, of course, America didn't exist around the time of Christendom, so we use the example of France, but the same logic would play out in French foreign policy. The French were in Mali the last couple of weeks, fighting the war on terror there, and of course, we know that that story's not over yet, but it's interesting to study, it's interesting to follow up on, and I think the French intervention in Mali is very different to the French interventions that would have taken place under the regime of Westphalia. France, just as much of America, is now serving the agenda of this post-Cold War globalization, that the mandate of which is to preserve freedom of markets and to preserve political liberty, and to defend those countries that already have it against the potential aggression of terrorists down the road. So I think constructivism has a very strong claim to be able to explain then these historical transformations. So there's, I guess, three consequences. Oh, excuse me, I have my slides a little back to front. Two consequences. Let me go to this slide first, and then I'll get back to the other slide. Two consequences of constructivism. First of all, that social knowledge matters, that shared norms and rules can shape relations between actors, i.e. that we are liberal and you are not. Clearly that matters. And then also what we're saying is that if identities matter, social knowledge matters, then that change is possible. Social relations are an ongoing process. Structure is in no way fixed. States make choices in the process of interacting with each other. Thereby, the conclusion is that anarchy is what states make of it over time. And so the point is then that change can happen, right? And we can see from our two conclusions. One is to do with identity, the other is to do with process and change. And then we've drilled down on the idea of having these different types of understandings of sovereignty, different types of understandings of the normative purpose of the nation state over time. Now let's go back to that slide we just had there a minute ago. Personally, for me, I think this is the most important slide in the lecture, because I think it's here that we come to understand and explain some very important things about how these ideas map onto each other. Okay, so you might say, having listened to me talk about constructivism, that constructivism sounds like a very liberal theory. It's not. As you can see here, constructivists can be realist or liberal in their view of how the world is currently structured. And they are not naive. They understand that ideas change slowly. So, you know, you're not going to find a constructivist necessarily making tree-hugger arguments per se, okay? I just wanted to put that out there. Constructivists can be convinced as much as a realist can that the world is currently configured in a realist fashion, or perhaps the world is configured in a liberal fashion. But that's the point. The point is that where realists and liberals make these arguments on the basis of how they see material wealth being distributed, i.e. in the zero-sum type framework imagined by the realists, my gain is your loss, and we're stuck in the prisoner's dilemma, and the point here is to think about relative gains, right? Your win is my loss in terms of security, right? If you have one more tank, we have an image of a tank here in the slide, that's one less tank that I have if you have one more. So that makes me paranoid, and I'm going to feel a security threat. Liberals, on the other hand, don't see this material question as being quite so absolute, because they see the world in terms of absolute gains, right? It's like John McCain argued during the election campaign against Obama in 2008. Just because you're gaining doesn't mean that I can't be gaining too, because, as he said, the pie can grow. You take a bigger piece of the pie, then I get a smaller piece, but that's not true if we're growing the pie. So that for that reason, liberals argue that the power of structure is low, that human beings can mitigate the power of anarchy to create paranoia. They can mitigate the prisoner's dilemma to create paranoia in the actors, and that the actors can actually come through in the end and actually find peace and reconciliation with each other. So that's very, very interesting for us. Constructivists, on the other hand, don't see the world in terms of this positive sum, zero sum type of framing. They see ideas as most important. They see stories as most important. And it doesn't matter then that Iran is a democracy or a dictatorship, a communist country or an Islamic country or a capitalist country. What matters is the stories that have been told about it. And that's why we said that neither the liberals nor the realists really have a full grasp on why conflicts happen unless they make this move to think about ideas. How do you explain Kosovo, a liberal democracy, an electoral democracy, being prosecuted by the international community? It certainly is a democracy, and there were elections there, but the people voted in a very they voted for a person that the Western world did not find agreeable, and of course terrible things were carried out, terrible atrocities were carried out. But it does give us pause to try to understand how ideas matter. Conversely, the wars between liberal and non-liberal countries, perhaps like Iran and the United States, not that that might ever happen, but I mean certainly one hopes it would never happen, but that can't necessarily just be explained by this positive sum, zero sum type analysis. You have to bring in some other kind of framework. You have to understand that that from a realist perspective, for example, there's no reason to go to war with Iran. From a liberal perspective, there's no reason to go to war with Iran, but many American foreign policy makers do want to invade Iran. And so why is that happening? Realists can't explain it, liberals can't explain it, constructivists can, because they talk about the mutually constitutive nature of ideas and action. And of course, Iran and the United States have very strong ideas about each other as being great Satans, as being mortal enemies, and it's been the way now since the 70s. So it's only to be expected, after that story being repeated over and over and over again by both countries, that a state of conflict or hostility at least might exist between the two countries. So I think that's a very important slide. Now, this is our final slide, and it's really just to try to capture some points. Well, it is our final slide, but I have more for you coming up once we've watched our movie, which is Wag the Dog. So you'll be watching Wag the Dog in class with me, or parts of it anyway, and as you're watching it, the question to think about is how much control do states have over this process? Because we've been talking about storytelling, and Alexander Wendt has been explaining to us that he believes that states can change the story. But the question is, if anarchy is what states make of it, how much control do they have over the storyline? And it's not entirely clear that the states are fully conscious of the extent to which they still tell the story. Or if they are, how much control they have, even if they are the storytellers once the story's in motion and everybody's acting as if the story is true, then how do you slow the story down? How do you change the tune? And that's kind of the question that the Wag the Dog movie takes up. So what I want you guys to focus on in your journal writing for this week is this question of how much control states have over calling the tune, right? Even if they were to be aware of everything Alexander Wendt is suggesting, how can they call the tune? So this slide just contrasts the theories that we've looked at, the three theories that we've looked at so far. For realism, liberalism, and constructivism, the primary actor is the state. The goal for all three theories is that the state should survive. The question, however, is whether realism and liberalism are actually explanations of what's going on in the world through their analysis of behavior, or whether they are scripts, whether they are in fact themselves stories or myths that, if they are popular enough, will actually shape the actions of states in the future, shape the behavior of states in the future. So realism says that states want to maximize their power and maintain their security. Liberals say that the prisoner's dilemma can be overcome through the promotion of institutions that allow for information sharing and trust. Constructivists, on the other hand, say, well, it really depends, right? We don't know how states are going to behave. It depends on whether they're reading from a realist or liberal script, basically. So what's going to mediate this? What's going to sort of be the thing to sort of focus on here that will anticipate or predict the way the anarchic structure will play out. For realists, what you've got to look at is the tendency of nation states to self-help. That is the tragedy, if you will, of great power politics, as John Mearsheimer once said. That always at that moment where they could cooperate in the prisoner's dilemma, there is this compunction to help themselves because they're afraid of each other, because they're afraid of the future, and the fact that they cannot fully be secure in their understanding of what their partners intend to do. Liberals believe that this can be mitigated, of course, as we've said, by the emergence of an international society built of republican democracies. But for constructivism, the mediating factor is identities and interests. Identities, of course, being the question of how we identify each other. Do we identify each other just as billiard balls according to the realist model or the liberal model? No. We identify each other as peoples of certain traditions with certain tendencies. And of course, our interests are going to be read into that, aren't they? What is in our interests? Our interest is to survive, but that survival is entirely contingent upon whether we perceive a threat in the first place. So that leads us to conclude then. What is our logic of anarchy? For realism, it is clearly conflictual because of the logic of self-help. For liberals, it is cooperative because eventually, at least between republican democracies, an international society can be produced. Because of the compelling impact of identities over time, for constructivists, the answer is that it's to do with what states make of it. That we will have peace if states read from a liberal script, and we will have anarchy if states read from a realist script. We will have conflictual anarchy, rather. So, okay, that's all I got to give today. We will start our analysis of the film the next day we meet, and I look forward to seeing you then. Take care.